Our next guest says that President Trump's use of executive orders are unprecedented in terms of the sweeping scope and in the sheer number. Joining us now, John Yoo, UC Berkeley law professor who helped expand presidential authority while serving as an official in President George W. Bush's Justice Department. John, it's great to see you. I see you all the time on the net. I've been watching you for years and years, all the way back to that horrible period back at the turn of the century. But I still can't believe you're at Berkeley. But I think it's nice. I think that's good. I think that you're like the you're like one of the DEI hires at Berkeley as a conservative. I think.
Hey, you're catching me right now in Austin, Texas, though, so I'm trying to get out while I can.
You're rubbing that all over. Yeah, you're feeling at home. John, and that intro sounded like it was almost a criticism of what President Trump is doing. I would imagine you'd make the case that anything that he's done executive power-wise at this point, it might be unprecedented in terms of size and scope, but you probably would say that he's totally entitled, and you probably are behind a lot of the stuff he's trying to do.
I think that's a fair point. I think he's going to win a lot of these current controversies, but there's some of his executive orders that are pushing the limits, and I do think he's going to get a more hostile reception in the courts. So, look, we're a little bit in shock, I think, right now, because we've had 4 years of Joe Biden who wasn't this active. President Trump has come in, and I think what he's trying to do is restore energy to the executive, which is Alexander Hamilton's phrase about why we even have a presidency. So all these things that we've been talking about, DOJ, cutting spending, firing people, those are the areas where I think President Trump is really going to prevail, because those are all about the president running the executive branch. These are all people within his branch of government, and the courts and Congress especially now have been fairly deferential to the president there. The executive orders where he's going to run into resistance are where he's trying to change the rights of people outside the executive branch. So I'd say, for example, trying to end birthright citizenship is going to get a harder time in the courts. He may well lose that at the Supreme Court. Declaring that there's an invasion happening on the southern border where the military can respond to immigration and waive civilian immigration laws. That's going to run, I think, into trouble in the courts. But I think he's going to have a lot of success. And you're seeing it today. There are already courts that are pulling back from their initial attempts to stop it, looking at the spending accounts in the government, freezing spending temporarily, telling people that we may not need you to work at the government, take a buyout. There, I think the president he's kind of like the head of HR for the executive branch of government. There, I think he may ultimately prevail.
It's a beautiful system, isn't it? We've got all those district courts where you can shop your case around and find a judge that to your liking. But sooner or later, it gets to a point where, the adults are in charge. It's a beautiful system that we have. We were talking about that earlier. Eventually, we usually get it right. I want to get to something we've been talking about, and that is what's happening in New York with Mayor Adams. And even conservatives, Andrew McCarthy and others, think that smells kind of bad. There's a case being made in the Journal today that the Justice Department in the past has often deferred prosecution in exchange for companies changing their behavior and doing certain things. I don't know if that's the same as getting a politician or an elected official and having sort of a sort of Damocles hanging over Mayor Adams' head if he doesn't do what President Trump wants as far as immigration. Does this bother you? And then Andrew, you got to use your. It's his birthday, and I'm going to let him have a shot at you after that. But you're perfectly fine with this arrangement we're seeing between Tom Homan and Mayor Adams and President Trump.
This is not just something that the Justice Department has been doing recently. This is something that President Washington did. So this tradition of presidents saying, OK, prosecutors, and look, I totally sympathize with the prosecutors here. I was a Justice Department official, too. I totally see an expert saying, we got him on the facts. We got him on the law. I want to prosecute. The Justice Department generally doesn't pull back and dismiss charges when they think they can win in court. But presidents have a broader view. So look at President Washington. He actually had to face an insurrection. This was people in Western Pennsylvania who didn't want to pay taxes on whiskey. That's why we still call it the Whiskey Rebellion. I'm originally from Pennsylvania. I know people in my home state don't ever want to pay taxes on booze, right? So there was a rebellion in Western Pennsylvania. Washington went out in person, led an army in person to put it down. The prosecutors had people up on charges, and President Washington said, drop them all, because it's for the good of the country. We have to, live as one nation. And so I'm ordering the charges to be dropped. Now, I'm not saying that's exactly what President Trump did here, but we've always recognized that presidents can say, even if you could prosecute these guys, we have to balance that against things which are more important, which are in the public interest. Now, your example of deferred prosecution with corporations, I don't think that's exactly the same, but it's the same idea, which is that the prosecutors, they're the experts. The Justice Department officials like me, we have a kind of tunnel vision, and we do have to defer ultimately to a president who has to see whether we got to balance that against other interests.
John, let me ask you maybe this way. We talk about lawfare. We talk about lawlessness in this country. We talk about nobody being above the law. All of these issues, which, frankly, I would argue President Trump did run on. Meaning he said he wanted to get rid of this idea of lawfare, of politicizing the law, and contended repeatedly and successfully that President Biden was engaged in lawfare, something that he didn't believe that this country should be engaged in. So part of the conundrum in this particular instance is that I think people look at this and say, he's playing politics. He's playing politics with the law. And I think one thing that's important to understand in this particular case is this was a grand jury that indicted effectively this mayor. I'm not making a comment on the mayor's guilt or innocence. I'm just suggesting that it was my fellow citizens, your fellow citizens, that decided that this was a worthy case. And therefore, what you have in this situation is a president that is using politics, I think, very directly. The good news is it's transparent what's happening here. But it raises all sorts of other questions, not necessarily constitutional questions, but just questions in the public mind's eye. And maybe it depends on your politics, but it raises those questions and whether that undermines the credibility of the Justice Department and just the entire system.
Hey, well, I'm sure everybody said happy birthday. Happy birthday. I hope you guys have me back on again before your next birthday, by the way.
Yes.
But here's the way I would look at it. Here's the way I would look at it. I think there's a difference between policy and partisan politics. So I think the problem with the Biden prosecution of President Trump is that he was going after the guy who was running against him for president, trying to knock him off the ballot. That, I think, is Democrats versus Republicans. I totally agree with you. We don't want to see that in our prosecutions. I don't think that's what the Trump Justice Department or the Trump White House is doing here. Here's a Democratic mayor. And if you believe what the White House is saying, they want to let him off because they want him to help them achieve their overall policy goal of better immigration enforcement. That doesn't have to do with President Trump running for re-election. He can't, of course. It doesn't have to do with Republicans and Democrats. They're doing it for a policy reason. That's why I'm comparing it more to Washington's
Do you think it would be better for the president?
In his first term.
So, as you know, the lead prosecutor in the case who ultimately has resigned, who was a conservative, suggested that the right answer was for President Trump to pardon the mayor, which is to say, you know what, we're just going to take this off the table. This is not about anything else, but we're going to pardon the mayor. That would have been the sort of better approach to this situation, rather than to dismiss the case with prejudice, which then creates this even more. I mean, I've talked about it being almost a hostage situation, because the truth is that the mayor now has to do what the president wants, and if the mayor doesn't, it appears as if the president is suggesting that they will then prosecute this individual. Again, this is as political as it gets, right?
I think that's a fair point. Again, it's not political Republican versus Democrats. It's political in the sense of how does the federal government actually make sure Mayor Adams keeps his word? So if you give him a pardon, what happens if Mayor Adams says, I'm not going to help you with immigration anymore? So it's very much actually like what Joe was saying with the deferred prosecutions with corporations. It's the same idea.